Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm excited to share a solution that will breathe new life into a true classic, the original iMac G3. Mine here is a zippy 500 MHz model, and I've even boosted the RAM from its original 128 MB all the way up to a comfortable 640 MB. Now, as you might know, these vintage beauties can sometimes run into issues. In my case, I've encountered a common problem. The internal IDE bus has unfortunately failed. This means the iMac can no longer communicate with its built-in DVD or CD drive, and more importantly, it can't access the internal hard disk. But don't worry, this isn't the end for our trusty G3. We're going to get it up and running again in 2025 by using an external USB drive as its new main operating system drive, running the fantastic Mac OS 9.2.2. So, if you're ready to see how we can overcome this classic hardware hurdle and get this iconic machine back in action, stick with me. In the next steps, we're going to prepare the external USB drive that will become our new system. Let's get started. Hello everyone. If you're looking to install the classic Mac OS 9.2.2 on your beloved iMac G3 and need to use a USB drive as the main boot drive due to a failed IDE bus preventing the use of the internal DVD, CD drive and hard drive, you'll need to prepare that USB drive correctly. Here's a step-by-step guide on how to do it using macOS Disk Utility. First, plug your USB drive, at least 4 GB, but ideally larger to accommodate the OS and potential applications, into your modern macOS computer. Once it's recognized, open Disk Utility. You can find it by going to Applications, then Utilities, and then launching Disk Utility. In Disk Utility, you'll see a list of your internal and external drives on the left sidebar. Select your USB drive. Be very careful to select the correct drive to avoid accidentally erasing any important data. Once your USB drive is selected, click on the Erase button in the toolbar. A dialog box will appear asking for the name, format, and scheme. First, enter the desired name for your USB drive, something descriptive like OS 9 Boot USB, or iMac G3 OS 9. Next, for the format, you absolutely need to choose MS-DOS, FAT. Now, you might be wondering why we're using a Windows-centric format for a Mac's main boot drive. The reason is that the original firmware and early USB boot support on the iMac G3 have the best compatibility with the FAT file system for recognizing and booting from USB drives. While macOS 9.2.2 itself primarily uses the HFS Plus file system, the initial boot process from USB on the G3 almost always requires the drive to be formatted as FAT for the firmware to recognize it as a bootable volume. We will later place the OS 9.2.2 installation files onto this FAT formatted drive. Then, for the scheme, you must select Apple Partition Map. This partitioning scheme is specific to older Macintosh systems like your iMac G3. It tells the G3's firmware how the USB drive is organized and where to look for bootable partitions. Modern partitioning schemes like GUID Partition Map won't be recognized by the G3's boot ROM for USB booting. So, to reiterate, make sure you have selected in the dialog box for your USB drive the desired name for your bootable USB drive, format, MS-DOS, FAT, scheme, Apple Partition Map. Once you have these settings correctly chosen in the dialog box, double-check that you've selected the correct USB drive in the sidebar, and then click the Erase button within this dialog box to proceed with the formatting. After the formatting is complete, you will have USB drive 4 GB ready to be installation Mac OS 9.2.2 in next process, which we will use the installation disk on DVD or CD external drive. Alright everyone, so here's the setup that allowed us to breathe new life into our iMac G3 with a failed internal IDE. As you can see, we're working with the G3's 2 built-in USB 1.1 ports, not exactly a speed demon by today's standards, right? To get around this limited connectivity, our secret weapon is this trusty 4-port USB 3.0 hub. Now, while the G3 will only see these devices at USB 1.1 speeds, this hub is essential for connecting everything we need simultaneously. Our external DVD drive to read the Mac OS 9.2.2 installation disk, a mouse and keyboard for navigation, and crucially, the external USB drive or SSD that will become our new, faster system drive. Powering all these peripherals is key, especially the external DVD drive. This USB 3.0 hub provides enough juice to keep it spinning and reading that vital installation CD. So, how did we actually get the OS onto that external drive? Well, the first step was to boot the iMac G3 from the Mac OS 9.2.2 installation CD in our external DVD drive. To do this, you need to hold down the Option or Alt key on your keyboard right after you press the power button. This brings up the Startup Manager, a lifesaver that lets you choose which device to boot from. We simply selected our external USB DVD drive. Once the G3 booted into the installer, the process was pretty standard Mac OS 9.2.2 setup. The crucial part here is that during the installation, we selected our connected USB drive or SSD as the destination for the operating system. Now, before we even got to this point, that target USB or SSD drive was likely prepared with the FAT32 format and an Apple partition map. This initial formatting helps the G3's older firmware recognize the drive during the early stages. Alright everyone, welcome back. Now that we've got our trusty 4GB USB drive prepped and ready, think of it as our essential toolkit for this classic Mac adventure. The next crucial step is to get our hands on the magic that will bring our iMac G3 back to life. The Mac OS 9.2.2 installation files. Now, for this journey, we're going old school cool. We're going to be using a physical CD or DVD to kickstart the installation process. So, grab your blank disk, and let's head over to the digital treasure trove that is the Macintosh repository. I've put a direct link right here on the screen and in the description below. https://www.macintoshrepository.org/1307-mac-os-9-2-2-universal-2002-edition-. What we're looking for on this page is the zip file named macOS 922 uni.zip. Go ahead and download that to your modern computer. Inside this zip archive is an ISO file. That's essentially a digital image of a CD or DVD, and it's called macOS 922 uni.iso. This is the good stuff, the complete Mac OS 9.2.2 Universal Edition. Once you've got that ISO file downloaded, the next step is to burn it onto a blank CDR or DVD-R disk. Now, this isn't like just copying files onto a USB drive. We need to create a proper bootable disk image. When you use your burning software, whether it's built into your operating system or a dedicated program like ImageBurn on Windows or Disk Utility on macOS, make sure you select the option to Burn Image or Burn ISO Image to Disk. And here's a little tip from the vintage Mac experts. For the best compatibility and to minimize potential errors during the installation on our older G3, it's often recommended to burn this ISO image at a low speed, ideally around 4x. This helps ensure a clean and accurate transfer of the data onto the disk. So, go ahead and get that macOS 922 uni.zip downloaded, extract the macOS 922 uni.iso file, and burn it to a CD or DVD at a low speed. Once that disk is ready, we'll be one big step closer to getting Mac OS 9.2.2 running on our resurrected iMac G3. Follow me to the next stage. The Mac OS 9.2.2 installer then took over, reformatting the necessary partition on our USB or SSD to the native Mac OS Extended, HFS Plus, file system, the one that OS 9 loves, and copied all the system files onto it. And the magic final step? After the installation was complete, we were able to reboot the iMac G3 directly from that external USB or SSD drive. This is where the real benefit kicks in, especially if you're using an SSD. The speed difference compared to the original internal hard drive can be night and day. So, in a nutshell, our success here relied on using a simple USB hub to overcome the G3's port limitations and ensure everything had power. We booted from an external DVD, installed onto a pre-formatted USB or SSD, and now, this classic iMac G3 is running smoothly off an external drive, ready for action in 2025. Alright everyone, let's talk about the amazing outcome of getting Mac OS 9.2.2 running on our resurrected iMac G3 from an external USB drive. Now that the installation is complete and we're booting from that external USB or SSD, I wanted to share a really interesting finding about the actual disk space used by a full installation of the operating system. Based on my experience with this setup, after installing all the core components of Mac OS 9.2.2 onto the external drive, the total disk space occupied is surprisingly minimal. We're talking less than 390 megabytes. Think about that for a second. This means that even those relatively small, older USB drives you might have lying around, like 4 GB or 8 GB sticks, are more than capable of holding a complete and bootable installation of Mac OS 9.2.2. Remember how we initially formatted that USB drive as FAT32 with an Apple partition map so the G3's firmware could recognize it during the boot process? Well, once the Mac OS 9.2.2 installer kicked in, it reformatted the necessary partition to the native Mac OS Extended, HFS Plus, format, which is what OS 9 loves. And even after this reformatting and the full OS installation, it still takes up less than 390 megabytes of space. This is fantastic news because it means you don't need a massive external drive to bring your G3 back to life with a USB boot. Those smaller, more readily available USB sticks are perfectly adequate. So, if you're considering this project, don't let the thought of needing a huge external drive hold you back. A simple 4 GB or 8 GB USB drive, prepared correctly, is all you need to house a fully functional and bootable Mac OS 9.2.2 system, ready to bring that classic iMac G3 into the modern era of 2025. Alright everyone, let's take our resurrected iMac G3 running Mac OS 9.2.2 a step further and boost its multimedia chops. Today, we're tackling the installation of QuickTime Player 6.0, a key piece of software for playing a wider variety of audio and video formats on this classic machine. Now, you might think getting modern, or at least more diverse, multimedia on a PowerPC Mac from 2002 would be a headache, right? Well, I was pleasantly surprised at how straightforward it turned out to be, thanks to a direct file transfer method. The real magic here lies in finding the right file. A compressed archive called QuickTimeInstaller.sme_.bin. I managed to track it down on the fantastic Macintosh repository. I'll put a direct link on the screen and in the description. https://www.macintoshrepository.org/2473-quicktime-6-0-3. This specific file seems to be the golden ticket for a hassle-free installation. So, the process was surprisingly simple. First, I used my modern MacBook Pro to copy this QuickTime_installer.sme_.bin file onto a standard USB drive, the same one we prepped earlier for file transfers to the G3. Next, I plugged that USB drive right into our trusty iMac G3 running Mac OS 9.2.2. Now for the installation itself. On the iMac, I simply double-clicked the QuickTime_installer.sme_.bin file. This kicked off a decompression process, and just like that, a new file appeared on the desktop, QuickTime_installer.sme. Then, another double-click on this newly created QuickTime_installer.sme file launched the familiar QuickTime 6 installation wizard, just like you might remember from back in the day. Interestingly, the installer gave me the option to choose between the basic and pro versions. And here's a little bonus. The registration screen for both versions was incredibly easy to bypass. All I had to do was enter a name, any name would do, click, continue, and the installation proceeded without asking for a registration key. That's a win for keeping things simple on our vintage setup. Finally, after the installation was complete, I performed a quick restart of the iMac G3 running Mac OS 9.2.2. This finalized the integration of QuickTime Player 6.0 into the system. And that's it. QuickTime Player 6.0 was successfully installed and is now ready to handle a much wider range of multimedia formats on our classic iMac G3. No complicated disk image mounting or hunting for registration keys needed for basic playback. This direct file transfer and installation method offers a surprisingly smooth way to breathe even more life into these amazing vintage machines. Alright everyone, so we've got QuickTime 6.0 up and running on our classic iMac G3, which is fantastic. But as you might expect, it doesn't exactly play every modern video format under the sun, particularly those common MP4 files we see everywhere today. So, How do we bridge this gap and watch some of our favorite videos on this vintage machine? Well, the solution I found was surprisingly simple, thanks to the power of online conversion tools. The real workhorse here is a fantastic website called Convertio. I've put the direct link on the screen and in the description below. https://convertio.co/mp4-mpeg/. This online tool handles the heavy lifting of transforming those modern MP4 files into a format that our trusty QuickTime 6.0 on Mac OS 9.2.2 can understand. mpeg.mpg. The process is super straightforward. On your modern computer, in my case, my MacBook Pro, you simply upload the MP4 video file you want to watch to Convertio's website. Then, you choose mpeg.mpg as the output format. Now, here's an interesting observation. Within Convertio, the default MPEG encoding settings seem to work like a charm with QuickTime 6 on OS 9.2.2. You don't need to fiddle with complex codec options or try to remember obscure settings. Just select MPEG as the output. Once the conversion is complete, you simply download the resulting .mpg file to your modern computer. The next step is familiar. We transfer that .mpg file onto a USB drive, the same one we've been using to shuttle files to our iMac G3. Finally, plug that USB drive into the iMac G3, navigate to the .mpg file, and double-click it. And, success! QuickTime Player 6.0 on macOS 9.2.2 should happily start playing your converted video. Now, there's a bit of a trade-off here, and it's something important to note. You might find that the converted .mpg file is significantly larger than the original MP4. For example, a relatively small 7 MB MP4 file became a whopping 23 MB MPG in my test. This increase in file size is something to be aware of, especially with limited storage on older systems. However, the key takeaway here is that using an online conversion tool like Convertio provides a surprisingly straightforward way to overcome those compatibility hurdles between modern video formats and older media players like QuickTime 6.0. It might not be the most storage-efficient solution, but it gets the job done without the need for complex codec installations or troubleshooting. It's a great example of how modern online tools can help bridge the gap and let us enjoy a wider range of multimedia on our beloved vintage machines.